Now what I want you guys to do, we're going to get out of this file that we're working in right now, and we're going to go to open. No, I mean you could save it if you want. I'm not going to save it, but I'm going to go to the items to import, and this time I'm going to come under where it says shell here, and I'm not in the no materials folder, I'm just in the regular folder, and I want to open this up. And one of the things that I want to show you, a lot of times as you're working with your interior scenes, you're kind of going and you find some couch online. There's a couple of sources I can give you guys after class, online sources to like get stuff. Half the time, like if I'm doing something quick, I just go to the SketchUp warehouse and I'm grabbing stuff. That stuff will sometimes come with maps and whatever. And I want to make sure all that's pathed correctly. So if I'm opening some file or bringing something in or some piece of furniture or some plant or whatever it is I'm working with within my scene, and it has some kind of textures or whatever associated with it, when you bring it in and open it up, it might give you some warning that it's missing the files. And right now that's the case with the shell file. So when I open the shell file, it's telling me that it's missing the stuff that it needs in order for this to render properly. So if I hit continue, I want to come up to my start menu and come down to manage and up to the asset tracking. Now when I open that up, that's basically showing me everything that is active within the scene. So it's telling me this is my file right here, and here are all my maps and shaders that are active in the scene. Now Craig's going to go over materials and far more in-depth kind of things over the next couple of weeks. We'll do the cherry. Damn it. All right, fine. Give me the regular. You sure? All right. But I mean, right now everything's kind of preset up for you guys. I just want to make sure that I select the first file here, come down, hold shift, go down to the bottom file, select path at the top, and do set path. Once this dialog comes up, I click on the three buttons over here on the right. And if I go up one folder, there's a folder called Assets, which I've pre-dumped everything in here that you guys need. So if you just select one of those files, it doesn't matter which file you select. I could select this file or that file, it doesn't matter. If I hit Use Path, it automatically drops that into my line here. I click OK. And instead of file missing now, you see the status is now OK for all of those files. So if I'm having some issue and something's not rendering right and I'm pulling it from somewhere else, and I know I have the path, or I know I have the file somewhere on my computer, you need to go in here and basically repath it so that it renders out correctly. So what I want to do is I want to save this file now. I then want to go and open, I'm going to open the island file. Again, same thing, it's coming up missing external files. So I'm going to come under my start logo, come down to manage, come up to asset tracking. Click, hold shift, click, path, set path, click on my three dots, go up one folder for me, go to assets, select one of those files, hit use path, hit OK. Again, all of those say OK, and I want to save that file. So right now, the way I've given you these files, all of those links are broken. And I did that deliberately so that you have to go in here, open these files, and make sure that everything's pathed correctly. So I'm going to go into table now. Again, everything's missing. I come under manage, assets. I want to make sure all of these are set to that folder. Use path. OK, close, save. And my last file is the wall items. So I'm going to open this guy up. This file is kind of large, so it took a second. But click continue, come down to manage, assets. Again, select everything, path, set path, click on my three dots, come up a folder, go to assets, select the file again, hit use path, OK, close out of here and save that file. So you guys got to do a little bit of work to get some of the goodies in this interior scene to work properly. But now that that's all done, if I go back to open, what I want to do is I want to go up and I'm going to go down to the 04 file here, which is the fill lights. And I'm going to open that back up. And that should be basically where we left off, with the two lights in the scene and the sun. And hopefully if I go under my references, XREF scene, I want to make sure it's pulling from my no materials file, which it is right now. And I'm just going to quickly check my render setup to make sure that under the global settings the displacement is off. So it is. So basically everything is pretty similar to the way it should have been. So if I hit render here, this should be looking pretty similar to where we had it before. Now it looks like it's a little more refined. So I actually selected one of the lights in the scene here. So if I just hit, if I hit Shift G in my scene and I select that light, you can see if I scroll down, I had my subdivides turned up in this. So I can turn these back down to the default of 8. And when I click render again, oops. If I hit Shift G to show my geometry, when I click render again, you can see this is basically back to exactly where we left off. Now I mentioned there's the two ways of doing it: using the sky portal or using the what I like to kind of use, a fill light in the scene. Personally, I kind of like using the fill light more, just because it's a little bit easier to control. You can kind of get just better lighting overall, better fill overall going in your scene. You can also use the portals, but I feel like using the portals is something that'll get you a more natural looking scene, but at the same time, consider yourself basically an artist. You want to make something that looks good and nice, and it's not necessarily always about being 100% accurate in terms of lighting. So for me, I personally like doing more of a fill light approach versus using the sky portals to filter in my sun. So whatever you kind of want to do is up to you. But I mean, we're going to continue on with the fill lights, and that's the file that I've opened and kind of pushing forward through here. I turn my subdivides just back up here just to 60. I mean, you could, like I said, you could leave them at 8 or turn them back up. I'm going to turn them up just to clean up some of the artifacts a little bit in the scene for right now. So if I go back up into my top view and hit Z for zoom, basically this is my scene. One last thing that I didn't talk about in the last scene, which I can notice here, is my sun is quite a bit larger. And that's because if I pull up my, if I go back to my render setup and I come to my frame buffer, if I pull that window back up here, basically making my sun super large like that, which if I scroll down here, it's under the size multiplier, I have a value of 11. That's going to give me a really soft, kind of fuzzy value here around the light that's coming in. If I turn this to something like 0.2, which I think is what it was set up in the last file, it was fairly small. If I go back into my camera view and hit render, you can see the difference in the quality of the shadow. It's a much crisper line compared to when I had that value turned way up. So that was one thing that when I opened the file I noticed right away that I've had forgot to mention over the last stuff. So again, it kind of depends on how you want your shadows to look. If you want them to be a lot softer around the edges as that light is filtering into your space, or if you want it to be a nice hard crisp edge, all you have to do is adjust the size multiplier of your sun. And I want to go back up into my top view here. What I want to show you is another way to control your reference that you've brought in. Right now it's in the scene, and I'm going to hit Shift L to hide my lights and Shift C to hide my camera. So right now it's geometry in the scene, but you see I can't select it, I can't do anything with it, it's just kind of there I'm controlling it through this XREF Scenes panel. Now, if I wanted to make some change to this, I'd have to open that file up, make the change to it, and then come back to this file. You know, which is all right if you have you know, a couple of different schemes. Maybe you have 3 or 4 different schemes and you have different things saved out, so I can just add these different schemes. But if I'm working in the same space and I take this model, I make some modification to it, I save it out as a separate scheme, so now I have option 2 with my geometry, and it's like, all right, I bring it back in and I hit add. Well, all that's going to do is that's going to drop it back in right on top of this model. So if I want to have both of them active for whatever reason in the same space, but I don't want to have to go into one file and then move it and then add it, once it comes into my scene, I come over to my Create panel and I'm going to go to my Helpers tab. And from my Helpers tab, I just want to make a dummy. And I'm going to click and drag in my screen and let go until I have just my dummy over here on my screen. What I then want to do is I want to select this file and I want to bind it to an object. The object I'm going to bind it to is that dummy that I just created. So as soon as I bring my mouse over top of that dummy, you see my cursor changes, and I click and select that dummy. And it tells me right here the parent object is now dummy 001. So if I kind of move this off to the side here, I can then come into my scene and select my dummy and move my object out of the way. So I don't necessarily have to go back into that file, open it, move it out of the way. If I'm working with a couple of different schemes, I can manage something like that in here. So then when I come and I click add and I go back up, I want to select, you know, this option which has the materials on it. I'll hit open. You can see that's coming in right where the old one just was. And I've moved this guy out of the way. So maybe you're working with a couple of different schemes and you're working with a couple of different X references and you want to move one off to the side as you're working in your file that has the lighting and the camera. And you're not just working on modeling and geometry. So you can kind of do some manipulations like that. You can rotate it, you can scale it. I mean, just basic geometries. It's anything you do to that dummy object, it's going to do to that parent object which it's tied to. So those two are essentially linked together. So you can do basic manipulations if you need to without having to go back into that file and do those manipulations. For right now, what I want to do is I just want to turn off my file here that isn't from the no materials. So I'm just going to unenable it. You see my dummy object is still there, but my building file has basically gone away. And if I hit Shift H on the keyboard, that hides that dummy object just so it's off my screen. The next thing I want to do is I want to come in here. I've repathed all of my stuff. And I'm going to start adding these things in here. Now I already have them placed, so when I add them in, they're going to come into place. But again, if I have a couple of different options for my island configuration, I can have that going there. If I have a couple of different options for my, you know, whatever the area where the table's at, I can bring that in here and work with that. I can, you know, do whatever with these X references. So it's a pretty handy way to manage as you're working with a bunch of different files, bringing this stuff in. So I have the table, I have the island, I need to bring in my wall items, hit open. And what I want to do is, I'm actually going to turn these to box, because you can see I'm starting to lag a little bit now that I have all this crap in here. Turn those to box as well, and I'll turn my island to box as well. So with all of those in my scene, and everything except for the shell is still the regular geometry, but the table is active as a box, and so is my wall items and my island. So I can then, you know, easily move around. Everything is still fairly light, even though I have everything kind of placed in here. Now maybe I'm doing some work within this file. and so I want to leave one of those active, so I just come back to that, and you can always just turn that off. Alright, so one of the things I want to do now is we're going to add a certain type of light in this scene. Now, I mean, overall I'm pretty happy with the lighting I have, and I could probably render it out and get something pretty similar to the image that I had showed you guys. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into a front view, and actually I need to hit L for left, and I want to look at these shelves that I have here with these containers, and I'm going to add a certain light to it called an IES light, and this light allows me to pick a certain profile with the light. And within the folder structure that I gave you, there's the IES viewer folder, and I gave you guys actually a bunch of different profiles here from Lithonia. So if you come in here and actually look at these folders, you can see there's these IES files in the folder. If you go back up to the top IES viewer, I gave you guys an IES viewer setup. So if you guys want to go ahead and run and install that, what that is, if I pull this up here on my computer, is it's a really simple program that once you go to where your files are located, you can come in and select one of your IES lights. And I don't know, Craig, have these guys had anything with
Who here's had Mechalek? So in Mechalek, have you guys gone over lighting yet? Perfect.
Yeah, that's terrific.
So now you'll be able to look at your lighting profiles in Mechalek.
So you can actually look at your profile here, and there's a little button here that says render. If I click this, it's giving me a preview of what that light is going to look like in my scene and what it's going to do if I put that right up against the wall. I can, just real basic parameters, control the brightness of it, control my distance. So if I move it away from the wall, you can kind of see the effect of it. If I move it closer to the wall, you can see the effect of it. I think distance is the same thing, just further away or closer. So it's kind of like basically a wall in space somewhere, and that's what that profile would do if I'm bringing it into my scene. Now what's really nice about this, it's like, okay, well I have, like 100 of these freaking files all over the place. I can select just one of these files and I can go and click through all of them, or on my keyboard I can just hit down, and you can see my profile is changing as I go through these real quick. As my profile changes, also you can see my rendering is changing to give me an idea of what this is looking like. And right now I think I'm in like obviously some type of wall washing fluorescent, it looks like. So you can see all of these are pretty similar. Some of them have some uplighting to them versus just downlighting, but all of them are pretty much the same thing. So if I get out of the architectural here, fluorescent, I'm going to come up into my downlighting, into where the number 6 is. And if I pull this up and I run through these guys, you can see I'm starting to get some more different profiles here for more of like a kind of like a can downlight that I want to add to my space. So have you guys gotten the viewer installed at all? One person, yes. Did it work for your machine? Yeah. Yeah. So once I kind of find something that I'm happy with, I just run through these. Just kind of doing this off the cuff. I think these were a little bit better. We'll go with this one here. So you might have to like write this down somewhere or just remember the number. So it's 890-10403. So if I close out of here and close out of here, get out of there, what I can do now that I'm in Max and I kind of have my number written down for my viewer, I come over to my Create panel, I come down to where there's lights, And again, I want to make sure I'm on my V-Ray light. And within the V-Ray light, it's not the V-Ray light that I'm selecting, but it's a V-Ray IES. And so when I click on V-Ray IES, that automatically makes it active. And I added my ortho snapping lock up here, just because I knew I was going to be doing this and I didn't notice it up there. But that allows me to basically click and make sure I'm at perfectly 90 degrees as I'm adding this light in here. So you can see it's locking me to my 90-degree movements here, my ortho movements. So I'm clicking and dragging down. If you guys click and drag down, it might not be perfectly straight down. But I just want to do something like that, click and drag it down. And then I want to turn off my ortho snapping lock. So once I have my light in here, right now it's not tied to anything. It's just a light in my scene that doesn't have the profile associated to it yet. So I have to come under my modify panel with that light selected. Now since I haven't clicked anything else, it's still selected in my scene. And I'm going to come down to where it says none here right at the top. And when I select that, I gave you the files here, so it's under the IES viewer, Lithonia downlighting 6, and it should be 890.104.03. So that's the light that I want. I'm going to click open. And you can see as soon as I did that, now that that profile is in there, my light changed the basically shape. And that's because I have used light shape in here. So if I zoom into this and actually go to my top view, hit Z for zoom, you can see it's basically changed if I go into my front view and Z for zoom again to basically just a flat circular downlight. Now if I had some other profile that was, one of those wall washes, for example, it might actually be kind of something similar to like a balloon that you're seeing there. So it gives you a rough idea of the shape if I have that enabled within the scene over here. And again, same thing, I can control the subdivides like I was controlling it with my big fill lights if I need to refine it some more. But 8 usually is okay for the default. So all these other settings I really don't mess with. Even the cutoff value is basically dictating what that light is affecting in the scene. So I believe it is the higher you go, the less it affects, and the lower the more it affects, if I'm correct. But I mean the default is set to 0.001. So I usually always just leave it at the default. I mean it's usually fine. The only thing you're really going to have to adjust with this light is your power down here at the bottom. And if you want some color, to be associated with it, maybe you're like, oh, this is supposed to be some blue LED or blue halogen or something. So maybe you adjust the color of it or the temperature of it to be a different color. But I mean, other than that, pretty much out of the box, you're just selecting that lighting profile. And that's all you really need to do for this light. And again, what's also nice, if I go over to my Max Start, go to my Manage, go to my Asset Tracking, if I go to File, Refresh, here at the top, you can actually see it's categorized. It's saying, okay, this scene has your maps and your shaders, which are here, and it has your photometric information, which you've added now, 890.104.03, which is here. So again, if I'm working in a file and maybe I get some light from somewhere, I know Revit, for example, has data within its lights where you can pull over IES data, and maybe you bring it into Max and you're missing your path to your light. Well, if your lighting isn't looking correct or the way you want it to look based on how you know that profile is supposed to give you your lights for your interior space, it might just be as simple as finding where that file is and making sure it's pathed to the correct location. So the last thing we're going to do is just select this light. I'm selecting the light and I'm holding control and making sure I get the target too. I'm going to go into my top view and I want to put it just underneath my cabinet. If I hit P for perspective and hold Alt to kind of drop it down in, I just want to put it underneath if I hit F3 to go into shaded here, I just want to get it underneath my cabinet here. and I want to bring it a little bit closer to the wall. The next thing I want to do, I hit T for top and F3 to get into wireframe. I'm going to go over to my Max icon up here. And before last week, Brian, he was importing different stuff. What he was doing is he was coming into his folder and he was just kind of grabbing stuff and dragging it over and dropping it in and selecting merge, which you can do. You know, you can also open your file and do whatever that way, but I'm going to do it through this command up here because it gives me a little more control. So I go to my Max and I go to import, and from this menu over here I'm selecting merge. And I'm going to go to where that file is at, which is under items to import, and I want to go to the 014 on. When I select OK or open, this dialog should pop up, and it's basically listing out the objects in the scene. Now, if you have a scene that's fairly complicated, I can filter what's coming in. So I know I have certain geometry in that file, so if I turn that off, if I had some line work or some lights or cameras or whatever it is I want to bring in, I can kind of turn this other stuff off, and if I had a camera in that file, I could turn all this other stuff off and only the camera would be visible. So versus what Brian was doing when he dragged that over and dropped that in, you notice like there was a V-Ray plane that came with it. You know, all he really wanted was the car. So this just gives you a way to kind of control what you bring in before you bring it in. Now I know in this file that it's just the light, so all of these things are associated to that light. So if I just click the top one, hold shift, and click the bottom one, click OK. And then I'll hit, without clicking anything else, I'll hit Z for zoom to bring me to that light. That basically brings me to my light, and it has all my different objects selected here. So before I do anything else, I want to go and hit group here at the top. And we'll just call this can light 1. So now if I click off of that and click back on it to select it, I can click anywhere on it and it's selecting all of those objects that I just brought in, which is basically making up this can light. So I'm going to go back into my top view, and I'm going to bring it over here to where my light is. And I'm going to hit F for my front view and bring it up to where my light is. Now, you know, I'd have to like cut this out for the geometry, but I'm just going to kind of drop it in here like this for right now, just so that it's underneath of my line here on my shelf. And what I need to do then is grab my light and bring my light down as well. And I could also come into my top view and just kind of scale this a little bit so it's not as big. So if I had my geometry, it's similar in size to my light. Go into my perspective view by hitting P and then F3 to go into shaded, so you can see that light is kind of placed into the scene. Now if you guys notice, now that we kind of have some materials in here and the different lighting in here, everything's kind of overblown, and you know, as I switch into my shaded view, one of the things that you can do is you can come over into where it says smooth and highlight. Come over to your lighting and shadows and down into configure. And it might be on scene lights, it might be on default lights, but you can basically switch it to default, and that should automatically bring you into a more workable environment in terms of how things are looking and where you're placing stuff. Now, like I said, if I really wanted to, I'd cut that out and put that light up there in its proper place. But it's more about, I just want to show you One was merging it in a different way, and two, the IES light, bringing that in. And if I wanted to, I can go into my top view, hit Z for zoom and F3. I could select just over top of that, and that should grab my light and the can. And you know, if I wanted to make a group of that, I can make a group of that. You know, can light 02, whatever. And I could have a couple of these guys along that wall. And I'll make an instance, and I'll do 3 of them. So then I have 3 of those guys along that wall. And if I hit Shift G to kind of hide my geometry, I can click on one of those lights, go to Group, and Open, so that I can get to the light and get to its parameters to adjust it. So right now I'm going to hit C for camera and Shift G to bring back my geometry. And I don't want to render this out with all the materials just yet. So I know last week we kind of showed you get this guy's this little tip as well. But I can come under my global switches here under Vray in my render setup. And I can turn on my override material. Now I'm just doing this so that it renders a little bit quicker here. And you see right now there's a generic white material in there. So if I actually bring up my material browser, which I have a feeling is off on my other screen, move. There it is. So if I actually click and drag this where it says generic white, I can click and drag this into my material browser, release it, make sure it's an instance. And so this is the material that's in there right now. And you can see it has a gray value, not pure white. And it has a V-Ray dirt in my diffuse channel. So when I click on that map, I don't know if you guys remember from last week, the occluded color is basically where the 2 pieces of geometry come together. It's going to put that in there. Almost like you could think of it like a little bit of dirt, but it's really more of like a simulated kind of shadow is what the V-Ray dirt is doing. So that's what the override material is. I'm just going to kind of leave it at those settings for right now. And make sure that's still at 600 here in my common tab. And everything else should be still fairly low. So when I'm in my camera view and I click render, see what this looks like. Did I click render? Yeah, there we go. So you can see this rendered out, and you can see the difference now where we have that V-Ray dirt material in there that's overriding kind of everything that's in the scene. But I don't see my lights over here that are up against this wall. So what I want to do is I'm going to close out of my render setup, and I still have my light selected. I haven't selected anything else in the scene. If you guys have clicked off the scene, you can hit Shift G to kind of isolate just your lights and select one of your lights. And again, you might have to open your group in order to select just the top portion of that light. I want to come down and I'll just add an extra 0 here. And I need to show my geometry again, so I'll hit Shift G and I'll hit render again. Did it? Show last frame buffer. Shoot. I think I minimized my frame buffer, and I think it went off of the screen. How can I get this guy back? So render setup. This is the rendered frame window. Show last frame buffer. No, that's under my max. Shit. There it is. So if you guys can see over there, I'm starting to see some of the light against the wall. Now, it's not really the best spot for that light, just because it's kind of ducked down underneath my surface. So to kind of show you what these can do, I'm going to actually grab this, just pull this out over here, and go to my front view. You know, you can do this if you want, or you don't have to. I'll just pull it up to my ceiling, hit C for camera, hit render again here. So you can kind of see the full effect of it there. Now, you know, if I had a series of cans along that wall, I could, you know, obviously march that down there and have that profile casting along the wall. And you can see it's also lighting up the floor below as well. So it's not just, you know, along the wall, but it's also giving you light in your scene. So, and again, it's all accurate to that IES data. So whatever profile you have loaded into your stuff, it's basically going to come in here and be as it should be in reality. So I know Lithonia, you can grab this stuff off their website, which is essentially what I've done for you guys. So you have their pretty much their full catalog of lighting profiles to use. And you can use that viewer and go through and just easily select stuff that you need to use. So if you're doing some classroom environment or some recreation center or whatever it is you're working on, and you have just some fluorescent lights in there, you know, with some uplighting, downlighting, you can go through and select under the architectural, the fluorescent, pick the profile you want and have it be accurate to what you're actually thinking for lighting in the space. You know, that definitely is one of the more critical things when you're working with the interior scenes, is just what that lighting is looking like.
Mental Ray does a daylighting analysis, light analysis. Does Vray have the same thing in it?
Not sure. I know what you're talking about, but I'm not sure. If
Like the light meter, have you played around with the light meter?
yeah, I've played around with it.
What does that do?
I don't think, I mean, like, I'm familiar with the Mental Ray version of it, and I don't think V-Ray has anything that is comparable to that. So I think if you're doing that type of like lighting analysis, where you're looking at the light coming in from your exterior, and you know, for say you're doing your lead calculation stuff, it's like, all right, I need to know the percentage of daylight coming in my natural lighting. I think you have to do that with the daylight system, with Mental Ray. Right, and do it all that way. I'm pretty sure you can't use a V-Ray Sun and work with it that way. Yeah. So, but I mean, really, if you're just using it for the calculation, it's not about rendering at that point. You're almost using it as like a data kind of analysis tool. You're gathering information. So if you go through some tutorials on how to set it up, you would just put in a sun. Materials don't matter. It could just be a plain white scene, because all you really want is the lighting information that's coming out of that. Well, and again, you know, using these same, say you're doing something with lighting calculations, like I know Max has the ability to do that. We're not necessarily covering it. But if you go under your lighting and you go to photometric, and I go to target light, when I click and create a target light in here, I should be able to select a profile from sphere, point, cylinder, or is it a free light that I'm creating? Advanced effects, no. not familiar with. I know there's a way that you can do it through the photometric lights. I think it's through the templates here, where you select one of these templates, and then you should be able to change out somewhere in here. You can actually select the profile then for the light. I don't know why I can't get up. Anyway, so you can do it if you're working in Mental Ray and you're just doing it for purposes of lighting calculation. Like you said, if you have to do it for some other class. I know there's a way that you can bring that same IES data into Mental Ray and then use the lighting calculation tools within Max to kind of get your values and point data that you need and lighting spreads and all of that. I'm just not familiar enough with it to do it on the spot. So anyway, now that that's basically set up, the light is kind of in there. I want to come under my override here in the Vray system, and I'm going to turn back on my displacement, and I want to turn off the override material. And I'm just going to render this guy out and see what it looks like. Now again, my settings are very low at this point, but it should give me a general idea of what things are looking like with materials in there. And it's going to take a little bit longer to go through and do the calculation with that displacement on, because what it's doing is it's taking that wall, and essentially, like I said, if you imagine taking that wall, you have your brick pattern laid out in it, you cut it up along the lines of the joint, and then you take the brick faces and then extrude it out. Essentially, that's what that map is doing. And like Craig said, he's going to go over some of that stuff next week or the week after, whenever he goes over it. But he's going to get really in depth with the material stuff. I know 3S Max has something new that they came out with. I forget what it's called off the top of my head, but it's like a procedural displacement mapping for stuff, to where you're not necessarily using like an image like a JPEG or something. The way this is set up, it's just using an image that has, you know, dark and light values in order to get that displacement. I'm not familiar with what you're talking about, but if you have the article, it'd be nice to send it along, read a little bit.
So, just going back, I missed how I don't know how to link the light profile to the light. How do you then, like, if that's a jump?
All I did was, I can actually minimize and minimize. Go into my top view here. What I had was, I had a piece of geometry and I had my light there. And right now I still have this group, so I'm going to do close my group and group ungroup. So I just had my geometry and my light separate. So if I move that back here and I just click over it and select both of them, so if I hold Alt and make sure I have both of those guys selected, I just did group and made another group within a group. So that light, all of those different parts are grouped together, and then I selected the light and the group of the light, and I did group and gave it a new name and clicked OK. So then that was linking the geometry to the light. So it was just a group. So, I mean, that's basically it. We're almost out of time anyway, so the last kind of thing I want to talk to you about real quickly, which I believe Craig's lecture next week is specifically on this topic. He's going to go over speed versus quality in your renderings. And I had done, last year we did a lecture series, or really wasn't a series, it was just one workshop. We tried to plow through in one day, which if you were here for that was draining, to say the least. So hopefully these have been more manageable. But at that one, I kind of went into a lot more details in some of the render settings, which Craig is going to do next week. And he should be able to easily fill the whole time slot just talking about these different stuff, adaptive DMC, fixed, adaptive subdivision, what all of these values are doing. The file I have set up for you here right now has basically been optimized. If I wanted to render this out, the final quality, you can see if I go back up to my Vray frame buffer and I show my last frame buffer, if I can get it to come up. There we go. So you can see basically where it's at and all the artifacts that are in the scene. Obviously, you know, I couldn't really show this up as a final rendering. One of the things I would do is I would come over to my common tab. I would crank up my resolution. Depending on what I'm printing it out, obviously you would figure out how many DPI you want to print it at. So if you're printing it out on like an 11 by 17, for example, I could crank this up to 1700, and I can see that my low value is at 958, which is not ideal. So I want my low value to be 1100. So basically what that calculation would work out to be is on the 11-inch side of the paper, when I print out this image, it'll be at roughly, it will be at 100 DPI for the 11-inch side, and then the 17-inch side will be a little bit above 100. Most of the stuff I'm doing is right around that, and you really can't tell that much of a difference. It's very subtle between 100 and 150. So if I wanted to do 150, I'd have to do 150 times 11, which is 1650. So then I would enter that value in, 1650. So then I know my 11-inch side of the paper is at 150 DPI, which is more than enough. And you can see my upper value is now at 2929. So it's like, depending on what you're plotting, you know, obviously if you're making this thing huge, like some 24 by 36, you can, you know, quickly find out that these numbers are going to get pretty big. And the higher you go, obviously, the longer it's going to take, which is why I say right around 100 is where you want to be. So if I was doing like an 11 by 17 print of this, or that's what it's going on my final board, it's not going to be any bigger than an 11 by 17 print, then that's the value that I'm going to run this at. I think when I did my final image, I actually did it at 1200 for my top value and 676 for my low value, just because I knew I was going to be presenting this on a projector. And you can obviously see when I go and pull up that final image here, I mean, it looks all right for my final on the projector screen. It's not looking atrocious or like, you know, what the hell is all those artifacts? It looks pretty decent on the screen. And you can see I actually had the render time enabled on this. On the final settings, it took me 58 minutes to render this out. The only setting that I changed within this file, which if you guys, you know, like I said, you could take this file and take out the geometry from it, take out those X references, pull in your own geometry and, you know, move your camera, set up a couple of different lights, and start to work with your own scene files. The only thing you'd have to change in the file, aside from your overall output size here, whatever it is you want it to be, you would come under the V-Ray tab, you would come down to where it's under adaptive DMC here, and you're just adjusting this maximum subdivides. So right now it's set to 1. 2 would be a little bit better of like a draft. 3 is like approaching kind of final quality. You're still going to have some artifacts. 4 is a pretty decent kind of number to run with. And 8 is actually what I ran that at last night. And like I said, it took about 50 minutes to run that out at that higher resolution. You know, obviously, the higher you go with this number, the longer it's going to take. So I'm usually at somewhere like 6 or 4. You know, I mean, like if I can get away with it, I'm running it at 3. Some of the things that you can do to get away with it, if you noticed when I had selected my light in my scene back here, and I was under my modify tab, there's that separate number in here, which is the subdivide number, which is higher. So you can keep this overall maximum subdivide a little bit lower, you know, like at a value of 4 or 5, so that your rendering is still going at a decent speed. And if you're getting some weird artifacts after you put in some lights, or, you know, like I said, we put in that fill light and I noticed the artifacts right away, which is why I turned up the subdivides just for that light. So everything in the scene, the way I have it set up to be optimized, is super low for your subdivisions. But because when I dropped that light in there, I knew it was giving me a lot more artifacts in my rendering and making it look a lot worse, I basically adjusted just that one value. And then when I go to do my final stuff, you know, in under an hour, I'm getting my final image out. And, you know, I had that cranked all the way up to 8. So Craig is, like I said, next week going to be talking specifically about what each of those things are doing. If you're using adaptive DMC, fixed, or adaptive subdivision, what those numbers specifically are controlling in relation to how it's actually messing with your pixels and your rendering, and why something takes 17 hours to render versus an hour. Because in the end, if you're doing your settings right and optimizing things, and you go to print that image that took 17 hours, and you go to print the image that took an hour, and you put them up on the wall, and you take a couple of steps back, they're going to be pretty damn comparable. I mean, it's not going to be like night and day, difference. And one took 17 hours and one took an hour, so all of those things, like Craig is, like I said, going to cover in a lot more detail. But that's where we're going to kind of wrap it up for today. And I believe I included that final image in there, in that folder for you guys to look at. But that really wraps up the interior lighting portion workshop. Is there any questions? Thanks, guys.